Hi, this is Jonathan Rosenhead, Jerusalem psychotherapist. This week's Torah and Psychology post for Parashat Teitzei is going to discuss diagnosing mental illness. In this week's Parsha, we read about the Ben Sora Umora, the rebellious son. And we can ask, what is a Ben Sora Umora? The Gemara in Sanhedrin presents various conditions that need to be met in order for the child to be classified as a Ben Sora Umora. They need to have reached a certain age, to have reached a certain level of physical maturity. They need to present certain addictive behavior in the amount of wine that they drink and meat that they eat. And there's also particular characteristics of the parents. And all these conditions need to be met in order for the child to be diagnosed as a Ben Sora Umora, diagnosed as an addict, and someone that can cause harm to themselves and to other people. And in therapy, in psychology, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders is used to diagnose mental illness, and it presents in detail and in bullet points the criterion for diagnosing a person with mental illness. But the question can be asked, if a person presents certain symptoms that meet these criterion for mental illness, does that mean that they should be diagnosed as having a mental illness? This question arises from the famous experiment of Rosenhan. The Rosenhan experiment challenged the validity of mental disorder, of mental illness diagnosis, because the experimenters feigned mental illness. They presented symptoms of hallucinations, and therefore they were admitted into a psychiatric hospital. But afterwards, once they were in the hospital, they started to behave normally. But they weren't believed, and they were diagnosed as having a mental illness and were prescribed psychiatric medication. So despite the controversy of this experiment, it does raise the question of the validity of mental illness, of diagnosing a mental illness. So perhaps we can ask, what is the purpose, what is the function of a diagnosis and of the DSM? And I think the answer comes from this week's Parsha, the Ben Sora Umora. Because the Gemara says that there never was and there never will be a Ben Sora Umora. That a child never meets the various conditions that need to be met in order to be classified as a Ben Sora Umora. So the Gemara says, what is the point of the Torah teaching us about the Ben Sora Umora? And it says, Dorish v'kabel schar, that you should learn about the Ben Sora Umora and get reward. So reward is an ambiguous term. So perhaps what it's trying to say is that the Torah, if something is written in the Torah, it's significant. It's trying to teach us something. It's there to educate us, perhaps to teach us about maladaptive behavior, and to educate us and to give us a guide. And I think this is important also to apply to the DSM. Perhaps you could say that a diagnosis is not valid. Perhaps even coining the terminology and the phrase of the psychiatrist Thomas Saz that he said that the mental illness is a myth, the myth of mental illness. But I think the DSM, like the Ben Sora Umora, is supposed to be a guide. It's there to give psychoeducation, to teach us and to give hope and guidance. That if someone does present symptoms that meet a certain diagnosis of mental illness, it's there to give hope that there is a name for what they are experiencing, and it is treatable, and it gives guidance for mental health practice. So it's important to make the distinction that a diagnosis does not define a person, but rather it gives hope and guidance to try to improve one's behavior and to improve one's mental health. Have a great Shabbos and keep well.